September 11, 1976. Scotland, Hogwarts.
Snape! Snape!
Cried the raven with excitement as Severus returned from the Saturday breakfast with food. The large black bird had been brought to Severus a few days earlier by Ernie Burke, a friend of Avery's who had been appointed head boy the previous year. After careful questioning, Severus learned that the crow, named Crank by him, had been discovered in a locked and abandoned classroom on the first floor. The bird had attempted to fly but had failed. Upon being caught by the students, Crank began repeatedly crying out Snape, an utterance that led Burke to assume the bird was Severus' familiar. Severus wouldn't reject such an unusual and intriguing creature, especially given that it had been brought to him. With little that was truly his own, the idea of a familiar held significant appeal. Though, considering his life's experiences, it wouldn't be a shock if the mischievous marauders were somehow involved. They might have charmed the bird to mimic offensive phrases or even employed a living dung bomb. Severus conducted thorough checks for transfigurations and enchantments but found nothing untoward. Despite this, an unease persisted, prompting Severus to place the familiar in the owl cage he had lent to Avery. Securely locking the cage, Severus also enacted other protective spells. Crank wasn't dull-witted and evidently desired to communicate, so Severus decided to experiment by removing the sound-dampening charms during the day. This way, the raven could hear voices, learn to mimic them, and perhaps repeat phrases. A talking raven would be quite the unique companion. The sound-muffling charms were only applied at night to prevent Crank from disturbing his roommate's sleep. Both Malsabert and Avery didn't object to the pet's presence, particularly since the raven remained quiet when they were in the room. Its primary reactions were limited to feeding times and whenever Severus was around. Since the werewolf incident in 5th year, an episode that had left Severus hospitalized, Avery and Malsabert had often accompanied Severus to the library or the Great Hall. They weren't exactly friends, but a mutual understanding had developed. Severus assisted them with their studies, and they understood that another lengthy hospitalization wouldn't bode well for them. The numerical advantage of 3 to 4 certainly helped. Facing the marauders wasn't as intimidating when they were outmatched. While the marauders hadn't targeted Severus when he wasn't alone, their behavior still retained its jackal-like nature. Ever since the werewolf episode, Severus had developed an aversion to full moons, meticulously tracking the moon's phases for magical reasons. Certain lunar days held specific significances. The 20th lunar day was ideal for harvesting flowering herbs, as they reached their peak potency. The 5th lunar day, known as the Unicorn Day, heightened the effectiveness of potions containing unicorn-derived ingredients by 1/3. However, the 12th lunar day was advised to avoid potion making, as most concoctions would curdle. Moreover, the full moon's influence between the 14th and 16th days was pronounced, affecting complex potions. Adding moon water during these days could balance ingredient reactions. Despite this, some potions might still only achieve an acceptable level of quality, rather than excellence. The September full moon fell on the 8th, a Wednesday. However, Lupin hadn't attended classes since the 7th. The new Gryffindor had also fallen ill, along with his friends, who appeared sluggish and drowsy, likely recovering from a night of revelry. Black's absence wasn't surprising. He was probably recovering from a night of excess. The elder Black's habits and behaviors held little interest for Severus. His mind was preoccupied with another concept. Being a 6th-year student now, Severus had gained access to the forbidden section of the library. Over the past 2 weeks, he had managed to find nearly all the information he needed and had completed his calculations. No longer wishing to live in fear of werewolves, Severus resolved to create a protective potion, an anti-lycanthropic potion that could be administered to werewolves to prevent them from transforming into monstrous creatures, or at least to retain their human consciousness during the transformation. It was akin to a form of forced animagus transformation. Severus had immersed himself in the study of werewolves for the past year, poring over the library's resources for information. The research of Damocles Belby, a seasoned expert in the field, had proven particularly valuable. Additionally, Severus managed to gain Madame Pomfrey's trust, the school healer who tended to him, and convinced her to share the records on Lupin. It was through Madame Pomfrey that Severus intended to administer the cure to the werewolf, mitigating his symptoms and preventing further instances of students being harmed by the rampaging creature that frequented the vicinity of Hogwarts. According to the wealth of books and research, numerous scientists, healers, and potion makers had attempted to find a cure for lycanthropy, but all had fallen short. Severus's aim wasn't to cure a werewolf and transform them into a normal human. Such a feat had proven impossible for countless others. Furthermore, it was scientifically established that lycanthropy, like vampirism, altered every organ, cell, and magical aspect of the body. A complete cure for such a transformation was unattainable. In fact, it was considered more humane to euthanize the afflicted. However, Severus faced a different challenge. Despite having all the calculations in place and an unwavering conviction in his solution, he was unable to concoct the potion. He lacked the necessary, and rather expensive, ingredients as well as suitable test subjects. It was highly unlikely that Lupin would consent to becoming a test subject for Severus's experiments, even if Severus managed to gather all the required components. He was also reluctant to approach Slughorn, the head of house, who seemed to be ignoring Severus's talents. Slughorn might be tempted to use Severus's potion for himself and
Snape, sad.
exclaimed the raven named Crank. I'm not sad, I'm thinking, Crank, Severus replied with a grin, engaging in an unusual conversation with the bird.
Less thinking, more eating, Snape.
Crank said with a hint of mischief in its eye. You're quite the demanding eater, aren't you? Severus chuckled at the playful exchange. But any creature spending significant time with a wizard would naturally learn and grow in intelligence. Those who raised post owls, for instance, would gradually imbue them with their magical essence. Starting from incubating eggs using special amulets and carriers, to training them and even feeding the chicks themselves, these owls would often become an integral part of the wizarding family. While most wizards didn't put in the effort to bond with their owls this deeply, it was certainly possible. Observing Crank, Severus deduced that the raven was relatively young, likely less than 6 months old. The downy feathers around its head were still somewhat fluffy, indicating its youth. The lack of extensive magical training might suggest that Crank's parents had nested within Hogwarts and passed down minimal magical knowledge. Ravens were known to be intelligent creatures, even without a significant magical connection. The familiarity with the name Snape likely indicated that someone had repeated the name often enough for Crank to remember it. Why are you so quiet? Severus asked Crank, who had turned away from the cage. Did it take offense?
Yes.
The animal barked.
Snape.
I'm sorry. Severus opened the cage and pulled Crank out, clinging desperately to his hand with long, clawed fingers. The large beak, now slightly disproportionately swollen, reminded him of the prominent part of his own face for which the marauders had teased him as a nosy bastard. Severus gently stroked the beak and throat of Crank, who fumbled and tried to dodge.
No tenderness, Snape.
My name seems to be quite popular with you, isn't it? Severus teased, noting that Crank would always respond with Snape but never Severus.
Yes. Snape.
Crank replied enthusiastically. Severus sighed. An unbearable urge to show Lily his familiar. To share this coal-black master who learned so quickly and almost had a dialogue. It was almost as if he was just like her, just as fallen from the nest. Severus had already figured out that Crump couldn't fly, only fluttering awkwardly as he seemed to lose himself in his wings. Oh, how Crank squealed as Severus used the stun to examine the carcass and wings to make sure all the bird's bones were intact. He'd even learned a new word in an instant, the very same word, imprison. Yes, Lily would have liked Crank, but the memory of that humiliation in front of the whole school disgusted Severus to the point of nausea. He'd tried to talk to Lily over the summer, but apparently he'd offended her too much. And then Severus was offended, too, because Potter was always around Lily at school, and her friend was quite fond of the idiot's advances. Someone had even told Severus that they were going to Hogsmeade together today. "It's Saturday, and I have some free time," Severus mused to Crank. "Would you like to learn how to fly properly?"
Fly?
Crank questioned. "Yes, use your wings to fly," Severus explained, his fingers lightly brushing against Crank's feathers. "To be a real bird."
Yes. Snape.
Crank responded with evident enthusiasm and comprehension. "Why should I go to Hogsmeade?" Severus muttered, feeling a pang of regret at the thought of Potter being with Lily there. "Is there anything I haven't seen in Hogsmeade? Perhaps I'd be better off studying with you." The flying lesson went quite well. Severus took a broom from the pantry. He didn't need anything super fast, so the dustpan was fine. He placed Crank on his shoulder and explained, "Now you and I are going to ascend higher. We'll observe the birds, and then you'll take flight while I assist you with magic to ensure your safety. Is that a deal?"
Yes, Snape.
Crank confirmed, listening to his thoughts and plan with interest. Of course, it didn't all go perfectly the first time. But after an hour of flying together, Crank had moved to the edge of the tree and opened his wings by himself, mimicking flight. The timid bird never wanted to stray far from the broom or Severus, casting wary glances at the ground. However, Severus, recalling that animals learn from their pack's examples, crafted a nearly exact replica of Crank from a suitable stone and made it fly, land, and flap its wings. Well, that should help you get used to the altitude. "Now let's practice flying and landing," Severus decided. "I'm going to let you fly and land, and you'll need to touch down on the ground. Or on my arm, as the situation may be. All right, Crank?"
All right, Snape.
The raven declared. Severus tossed Crank into the air and swiftly descended to the ground. It wasn't a perfect catch, but it was something. He observed as his raven flapped its wings, pausing midair before catching a current, making a circle, and beginning to descend. "Be careful. Don't rush it so much," Severus fretted, drawing his wand to catch the daring bird in case of trouble.
Whoa, what do we have here?
A sudden exclamation came from a familiar, malicious voice. Severus jumped, anger flashing across his face as he scanned the area and assumed a defensive stance.
What, wandering without your usual lackeys? Ah, yes, Malsabert and Avery, enjoying themselves in Hogsmeade. So, what's happening, Ninius?
Severus wasn't overly concerned for himself. He would fight back. It wouldn't be the first time, especially without Black, who was the most powerful wizard among them all, alongside Potter, Pettigrew, and Lupin. What truly troubled him was the certainty that the malevolent Gryffindors wouldn't hesitate to taunt his familiar or even harm an innocent bird for no reason. Hence, he couldn't afford to divert his attention for even a moment to check on Crank's well-being. "Things were going fine until your gang appeared," Severus replied when questioned about the situation. He hoped Crank wouldn't screech and draw attention to himself, or even better, that he'd fly away.
The 11th of September, 1976. Scotland, Hogwarts. Sergei soared through the air, and the sensation was simply amazing. Flying on his own wings, like a mythical Icarus. It made enduring all those days in Snape's cage worth it. Yes. When Sergei had initially believed that this transformation adventure wouldn't last long and that he could find a way to escape easily, he clearly hadn't taken into account the cunning and cleverness of the Slytherins. As the day wore on and the full moon passed, the spell on the cage seemed unrelenting. One positive aspect was that Snape didn't starve him. He provided plenty of meat, allowing Sergei to nibble away. What else was there to do? However, Sergei soon noticed that animal instincts were taking over in the raven's body, with his human consciousness struggling to remain dominant. He feared remaining in this form forever, forgetting who he was and what he desired from the world of magic. It was genuinely frightening. Thus, Sergei remained vigilant, even sleeping half awake, afraid of losing himself. He had already dealt with magic and serious memories before. Despairing was premature, so he focused on learning various words, aiming to become a proficient talker and perhaps negotiate his release. Snape had proven to be a reasonable caretaker, no experiments, mockery, feather-pulling, or teasing. He tended to Sergei's needs and cleaned his palate on time. The only instance he caused a nervous tic was when he used a spell to numb Sergei's body, opened his wings, and began to examine him. After the terrifying session, the doctor assured him that Sergei's bones were intact and that he could fly. He hadn't even known he was physically capable of it. But how could he learn to fly if he didn't allow his instincts to surface in his consciousness? Sergei suspected that if he embraced his inner bird, he could fly without issue. However, was there any hope of regaining control of his body? It would be best to consult those who were animagi and possessed knowledge about it, without subjecting himself to experimentation. Attempting animagi transformation alone was foolish and had led to such a troublesome situation. The realization was that birds like him shouldn't be confined all the time. In recent days, his vocabulary had expanded to 30 words, although most were cawing words, the easiest to shout, at the top of a crow's throat, or 1 or 2 syllable phrases. Still, that was progress. After spending 3 days in the cage, Sergei began to panic. He even contemplated telling Snape that he was Sirius Black. However, he couldn't manage to utter the name Sirius, and the surname Black only translated to Black in English, making it quite nonsensical, especially without a first name. All his attempts to clarify, Crank is Black, only earned him praise and a piece of meat for his newly learned word. He felt like banging his head against the bars, but on Saturday, Snape suddenly chose to teach him how to fly. It seemed like a chance to escape. Using a broom was an excellent idea, and Snape explained the mechanics of flying quite comprehensively, complete with examples. Thus, Sergei took flight. With conscious control over his body, he savored the sensation with a wince of delight. Out of the blue, several other figures emerged in the clearing before Hogwarts, and Sergei recognized them as his fellow marauders. Thoughts raced through his mind. Snape was momentarily distracted. This could be Sergei's opportunity to flee, potentially preserving the secret of the animagi. With a flap of his wings, he altered his course, soaring behind the massive Hufflepuff Tower and gently landing in the grass. Drawing upon his memory, Sergei recalled how to revert to his original form. Focusing intently, he initiated the reverse transformation. After ensuring that everything was as it should be, he hurried to the designated meeting spot near the wall to take action. "James!" he shouted at his mate as he saw some kind of spell smoldering on the tip of Potter's wand. "Leave him alone." Potter turned sharply and stared at him, eyes wide open. He even opened his mouth.
"Where the hell have you been, Siri? We've been looking for you everywhere."
"Not here," Sergei nodded, trying not to look at Snape, who now looked much smaller than usual. "And I asked you not to call me Siri." "Come on." The marauders obeyed, though, none of them turning their backs on Snape. Turning from a distance, Sergei saw that Snape, who had relaxed a little after their retreat, was looking around anxiously, trying to find his pet. He felt sick to his stomach. In 3.5 days, he had learned a few things about Severus Snape. Firstly, that he was a very lonely and uncommunicative man, who spent most of his time reading books and paying a lot of attention to the pet that had only been with him for a few days and was now gone forever.
"Sirius, it's so good to see you, mate. But where have you been? At first I thought you were holding a grudge, but then I got worried. You disappeared, and the map didn't show you anywhere. On the other hand, you didn't leave the castle, or McGonagall would have been all over you. We covered for you in your studies, of course, and I put alert charms on the map so I'd know if you turned up anywhere. We were in Hogsmeade when the alarm went off. I almost kissed Evans, by the way, so you owe me one. I saw you near Nunius, and then you disappeared. And I realized. We've never managed to get into the Slytherin rooms and the living room, so you've obviously been there these days. Did that snoop catch you somehow? Or were you up to something? I rounded up the boys and we rushed over here to save you. Why don't you say something?
Sergei digested the information James had given him. You're imagining things too much, he said, trying to keep his voice light. I was actually in Slytherin, but with my brother. We had a family thing, he said vaguely. Don't ask, I can't tell you.
And is Snape involved in these matters?
Regulus asked me not to touch him. Sergei wrinkled his nose slightly, giving a plausible version. They're sort of friends. And Reg is my brother.
You were always pissed off that Nunius would mess with your brother to mess with you.
I'll try not to freak out now, Sergei shrugged and sighed, making an angry face. I'd rather you didn't ask.
Alright, I see. It seems Regulus has a knack for getting you to make promises like that. Something tells me that this date and your strange illness over the summer.
Not a word. Sergei interrupted, feigning annoyance. Let's forget about Snape. As friends, I'm asking you to cut him some slack.
We understand, Sirius.
I didn't really want to.
Sergei breathed out quietly. The plan to minimize this years-long feud seemed to be working. Now it was time to stalk Regulus, so that his brother would know if anyone asked. A diverse array of dinner and lunch options served on regular plates, consumed with everyday cutlery, elevated Sergei's spirits to unprecedented heights. How wonderful it felt to be human. Flying was undoubtedly amazing, but each aspect had its own advantages. That was his sentiment until he spotted Snape seated at the Slytherin table, listlessly pushing his food around. Immediately, he was reminded of the question he had posed to Severus that morning, Snape. Why so gloomy? Essentially, Snape, a lonely and modest 16-year-old in worn robes, studying amidst a crowd of pure-blooded affluent elitists. Sirius recalled the second-hand textbooks bearing Snape's notes in the margins, and the cursed underpants James had coerced him into displaying to the entire Hogwarts. It was embarrassing for both Sirius and himself. He wasn't directly at fault, of course, and no one had compelled Snape to align himself with the Raven, but Sirius was manipulating him, genuinely striving to gain his trust in order to secure his own freedom. Should he offer Snape money to alleviate his guilt? But Snape was too proud to accept it. Sergei himself wouldn't accept it. Should he leave things as they were? However, that would lead Snape on a prolonged search. He was unyielding and obstinate. Sergei once experienced a similar situation with a cat in his previous life. During a May Day outing to a friend's countryside cottage to barbecue potatoes and meat on a spit, they took along their young cat, who had been living in their apartment since autumn. Chernish was afraid of everything initially, cautious about everything he encountered. But he eventually adjusted. Unfortunately, he jumped into the woods in a panic, spooked by a passing, vulgar car with a loud exhaust. Sergei spared no effort, combing through the entire forest near the cottages in search of the cat, to no avail. They called and searched, even leaving the meat behind. Sasha and Lyusia shed tears. Sergei scoured that village for nearly a month, calling for Chernish. He couldn't find peace. Chernish was an affectionate, gentle, and intelligent cat. Even after 2 years had passed since the incident with Chernish, it was only then that they welcomed Barsik into their lives. Natasha was also concerned. It took time to move on. After dinner, Sergei gave a nod to his friends and informed them that he was heading back to Regulus. They didn't mind much, being content with his explanation and desire for discretion. Everyone seemed preoccupied with their own matters. Potter was once again attending to Evans, Lupin had taken on the role of acting head boy, and Pettigrew was off somewhere. Regulus, can we talk? Sergei halted his younger brother, who was leisurely leaving the table after dinner, casting him a meaningful glance.
Sirius, where have you been?
Regulus questioned indignantly as they moved away from the bustling main crow.
I haven't seen you in days, and you haven't been in the Great Hall?
Sure. Sergei hushed him. I hope you haven't discussed this with anyone.
No, I haven't even mentioned it to Barty. I assumed you might be confined to the infirmary, but I didn't bother asking Potter and your friends. I intended to meet them in Hogsmeade today, but they had disappeared somewhere.
You're fortunate you didn't, Sergei ruffled his brother's dark hair. I've directed them to you. So, will you cover for me if anything happens?
Where were you really? You haven't left Hogwarts, have you? Otherwise, there would be Aurors scouring the area.
Ah. Sergei raised an eyebrow. I'll share all the details once you set up a meeting with your friend, Severus Snape.